You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. It's the first day of autumn, 1989, in an affluent Sydney suburb. Mosman is on the lower North Shore and known for being comfortable and safe, a short distance from Taronga Zoo and Balmoral Beach. An 82-year-old woman named Gwendoline Mitchell Hill is walking down Military Road towards her apartment in the late afternoon. She doesn't know that a man has spotted her, concocting a plan of what to do next. She won't make it inside, and she will be the first known victim of a vicious predator who will ravage the streets of Mosman, Lane Cove and Belrose for the next 12 months. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Mike Hagan, the lead investigator on a series of murders which became known as Sydney's Granny Killer case. It's the first day of autumn 1989 and a woman named Gwendoline Mitchell Hill is found bleeding by two schoolboys. Initially, what does it look like has happened to her?
Well, originally this was on the 1st of March 1989 and Glover, who turned out to be the serial killer, was in the Mosman area at the time and he saw 82-year-old Gwendoline Mitchell Hill. She was walking down Military Road. Glover took the opportunity because he had this motivation for murder in his mind. Glover returned to his car and he put a hammer under his belt. And then he followed Gwendoline Mitchell Hill to the entry foyer of her Military Road apartment building. And as she went to open the front door, he hit her with a hammer on the back of the head. He then continued to strike her about the head and the body and broke several of her ribs. It was a atrocious assault, which turned out to be a death and then turned out to be murder. Glover fled the scene and he took her purse containing some money. She was found by two schoolboys who were returning to the building, but she died shortly after. The police had no eyewitnesses or any leads and there was nothing concrete, so there was no forensic evidence available at that time. The crime was a short distance from Military Road. Good-intentioned neighbours thought that she'd fallen over because initially that's how it looked, that she'd merely had a fall. So they washed down the crime scene, acting in good faith. And at that stage, police assumed that this was just a mugging gone wrong. So that was the police involvement with that first murder. It was classified as a murder, but the actual type of murder was really unknown at that stage. It was just assumed, as I said, that it was just a bag snatch or a mugging gone wrong.
And this was in broad daylight, wasn't it?
Yes, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and only about 30 metres from Military Road, even though it was in view of people. And this is one of the characteristics of a serial killer. They just mould into the community. And he was never seen. So it was classified as a murder, obviously, but police were concerned at that point in time as to what was the actual motivation. Here's a lady that was viciously bashed to death, a small amount of money stolen out of her purse. Was this a petty thief or was there some other motivation going on? So that's what we were faced with in that first murder.
2 months later, an 84-year-old woman named Lady Ashton was followed into the foyer of her apartment, and she was later found by police. What did that crime scene look like? Were there similarities to Gwendoline?
Yes. One of the characteristics of serial murder for police is that when you have a one-off murder, it's treated as a one-off homicide. But where you get another homicide that is similar, where there's similarities in terms of the location, similarities in terms of the victim, similarities in terms of the method that the murder is carried out. And even though this was several weeks later, And the other interesting thing, it was in the same area. What happened was Glover saw Lady Ashton walking down Military Road, and he followed her into the bin room, which is a bin room at the bottom of the apartment building where she lived. And he threw her to the ground and repeatedly hit her head on the pavement. And then Glover removed her pantyhose and he strangled her. And he placed Lady Ashton's walking stick and shoes at her feet. There's two types of serial killers, either organised or disorganised. And there was a lot of organised evidence at this scene, which is one of the characteristics of serial murder. He then left with her purse containing some money. So here again, we've got a vicious assault several weeks after the first murder where money has been stolen out of her purse. And we say to ourselves, well, is there a similarity between these two murders? What evidence is there to combine them? Unfortunately, we made the decision that these murders were connected. Basically, at that second murder of Lady Ashton, we were starting to believe we had a serial killer.
You mentioned that with Lady Ashton, her pantyhose had been removed. Did it look like there had been some sort of sexual motivation to this crime?
Well, the moment we saw an elderly lady, she was 84 years of age, lying face down with her legs bare right up to the waist, we started to think, well, perhaps there is some sexual overtones or sexual motivation to this. But as it turned out, from a forensic point of view, we were later to establish at a post-mortem that there was no evidence of sexual interference at all. So this created some discussion for us as to what was going on. But we believe that in this case, the removal of the pantyhose was simply to be used as a weapon.
At this point, were police able to develop a profile of what kind of perpetrator might be responsible for these crimes?
Yes, one of the things we do start doing some criminal profiling. Where you get repetitive murder, we endeavour to do that, although it's sometimes difficult when you only have two occurrences. Sometimes it's easier to profile cases where you have several, and so you can link them all together. Later on, we did develop criminal profiling right through the investigation, but at this early stage, we did bring in the aspect of profiling. Some of the thoughts we had was, well, have we got a petty thief? Because we've got small amounts of money being stolen out of the purse of both ladies, but we've got this vicious assault as well, which normally doesn't go with a petty thief or a bag snatch. Normally a bag snatch in a public street is simply someone hits an elderly person from behind, knocks them down, grabs their purse and runs. But in this instance, we've got the offender actually staying at the crime scene and committing these atrocious violent acts and removing pantyhose and then strangling the victim. So have we got a petty thief, or have we got someone who's acting with a different motivation at all?
And when you're a detective, how does your process and your approach change when it looks to be a serial killer? Because that suggests that perhaps there's going to be more and it could be a similar victim profile. How did that discovery that you might have a serial killer on the streets of Mosman change your approach?
Well, what it does, it increases the intensity of the whole investigation. It raises the investigation into a higher level. More resources, more intense scrutiny about every aspect of the crime scene, the investigation, the environment, and so it does. The investigation increases, both with resources in terms of people power, and it makes a big difference. And the further this investigation continued, the more we increased the intensity and the resources to the investigation.
In the following months, there were a number of offences at retirement and nursing homes. What happened there, and were you thinking that they could be related to these crimes in Mosman?
Yes, we did, because the investigation went for 12 months. At a particular stage in the investigation, aside from the murders, we decided to expand the whole investigation process. So we started to look at assaults of elderly people in the suburbs, in the whole North Shore, actually. And even though none of those assaults led to murder, because we had, prior to these two murders, we had no other murders in the area that we could link these two murders to. But we did find some other assaults of elderly women, and it was a matter of us preparing flow charts and preparing other intelligence aspects, seeing to see if there was a relationship between some just common assaults where there were some instances of ladies who'd been shopping who had a bag snatched and then a person had run away. And so we did endeavour to try and link those, yes.
And some of these assaults had been indecent assaults. Were the women able to describe their attacker? Was there any evidence that they were able to give to authorities?
Well, later on, further down the investigation, when we got to later in the year, the first murder was in March. And after we had 3 or 4 murders and starting to collate this evidence, we did eventually establish like an identikit, which is just a police photographer or a police drawer preparing a sketch drawing of a particular suspect. And we did start getting this idea of a middle-aged, grey-haired man who was attacking women in the streets. And subsequently in the investigation, we did get a profile, a drawing of this person. But at that particular time, when having got that drawing, we couldn't relate that to any suspect we had for the murders at that point of time.
In November, so that's 9 months after that first known murder, a man offered to help an elderly woman with her groceries in Lane Cove. And Lane Cove is a suburb sort of close to Mosman, also on the North Shore. What took place there?
Well, the third murder was Margaret Pard, and that was at Lane Cove. But what happened prior to that murder, Glover approached a 78-year-old resident in the same area as he subsequently murdered Margaret Pard, and he actually asked if he could help her to carry her groceries to her home. And the lady thought, well, that was very nice. Here's this fellow who was at that stage in his 50s, middle-aged, and he decided to carry these groceries, and he actually took them to the front door. And unbeknownst to this lady, she thought that he was just doing her a good turn. And anyway, he carried the groceries to the front door. She invited him inside for a cup of tea, but he declined. And then he returned down the laneway to the main street. After the subsequent murder, which happened an hour or so later, we were able to get that information from that lady. So how fortunate was that lady? We don't know to this day why Glover didn't decide to pursue his criminal activity with that lady, but he actually declined a cup of tea and walked away. But having walked away, he then walked up the laneway, and then he saw 85-year-old widow Margaret Pard, and she was on her way home from grocery shopping. And so he followed her down the same laneway that he just walked down, carrying the groceries for the other lady, and he hit her on the back of the head with a blunt instrument. She collapsed. Glover then bent over her. He rearranged her clothing. He took off her shoes, a walking stick. He took a handbag, stole some money out of her handbag. It was a vicious assault. And later her body was found by a young schoolgirl who was also walking down the laneway at the time. And here again, neighbours acting in good faith thought that she'd fallen over when they found her, and they washed down the crime scene.
Do you, at that point, when you have what appears to be a serial killer who is attacking older women, do you develop a psychological profile in terms of what might be motivating him? Did you have any theories about why he had such hatred for older women?
Well, we did. And the interesting thing about this also, that this was at Lane Cove, where the other offences had all been in the Mosman area. And so what we've got here is what we call mobility in terms of criminal activity. And there were some people saying, oh, this is a copycat killing. And so one of the things we had to deal with was this a copycat killer, which is quite renowned in criminal activity, that you can get people who see a crime in the media and then they copy it and do it themselves. So you have two different offenders. But one of the things that negated the copycat syndrome was the fact that the circumstances of this murder, of this lady in the laneway at Lane Cove, even though it was several kilometres away from Mosman, was exactly the same. It was the same, what we call MO. It was a similar victim, an 85-year-old lady. She'd been shopping. The other two ladies had been shopping. They'd been followed down the laneway. She'd been attacked from behind, tremendous head injuries. Her clothing had been changed, her shoes, a walking stick, her handbag had been opened, money had been stolen again. So the similarities just leapt out at us. And so we made the decision immediately that this was the serial killer that we were looking for. And then we started to think again, developing this profile, this criminal profile. One of the main things for a detective is to think about or to get into the mind of the serial killer and try and work out what is it that's motivating. Because if you can work out what's motivating the killer, sometimes you can work out who it is just by the fact of the motivation, which is quite interesting. It's a very challenging, a very interesting aspect of investigation. And criminal profiling played a big part. So at this point of time, we were starting to develop an idea, but we still had this problem of, here we have a petty thief stealing money, and the money was very minor. I mean, these ladies, but they're all pensioners, they've been shopping, so we're not talking about thousands of dollars, we're just talking about tens of dollars that are being stolen. And so we started to develop a profile that what is motivating this killer is not so much the theft or the larceny of money. What is motivating him is some type of revenge, some type of payback to elderly women. And so this was an aspect we started looking at.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Mike Hagan about Sydney's granny killer murders. That same month, Muriel Falconer was attacked from behind as she was entering her home, but the difference was that police were able to establish an actual crime scene without having the neighbours clean up, which in the past had been taking away critical evidence. What evidence were you able to collect, and did it get you any closer to finding the person responsible?
Okay, yes. Now, after Margaret Pard was murdered on the 2nd of November at Lane Cove, within 24 hours, we were called to Belrose, to Wesley Gardens retirement village, where there was an 81-year-old resident there, Olive Cleveland. Now, Belrose is several kilometres north of Lane Cove, and she'd been walking in the retirement village late on a Friday afternoon when Glover saw her. Glover seized her from behind, forced her down the ramp into a secluded side lane where he hit her repeatedly. He pushed her head into the concrete pathway before he removed her pantyhose. So here again, we've got this aspect of a pantyhose being removed, and he tied it tightly around her neck and she was strangled. And once again, Glover rearranged her clothing and her shoes and her walking stick. So these similarities, characteristics of this serial killer are just bouncing out at us every time we go to the crime scene. And then he left and he took some money out of her handbag. Now, here again, we've got no eyewitnesses. So into these several murders, we've still got no eyewitnesses, and that's not unusual or uncommon with serial murder. Serial killers are able to mould themselves into the community. Often people don't see them, or if they do see them, they don't believe that they're killers. So that was that murder. And then we move over to the 23rd of November. Muriel Falconer had been shopping, and Glover was sitting in a hotel in Middle Head Road, Mosman, and he saw 93-year-old Muriel Falconer walking past the hotel. She was actually returning home with her shopping. And Glover went to his car, he retrieved a hammer and some gloves, and he followed Muriel Falconer to the exterior of her home, quietly moved up behind her while she was partially deaf and blind, 93 years of age. I mean, this is unbelievable. what's happening to these ladies. And he followed her to the front door. She put the key in the front door. He was standing right behind her, probably about a metre. And as she entered, she quietly moved in. And as she opened the door, he put his hand around her mouth to silence her. Then he repeatedly hit her on the back of the head with a hammer. She fell to the floor. And this was inside now. This was in the hallway of her home. So this is the first pristine crime scene that we had. All the other crime scenes were out in the public place. Here we've got a crime scene in a private home in the hallway. And he removed her pantyhose and strangled her. He searched her purse. There was money stolen from her purse. Now, that was on the Thursday, on the 23rd of November. And unfortunately, she wasn't found till the following day, when a next-door neighbour, who happened to be a nurse, who actually had a key, was looking for her neighbour, couldn't find her, so she went to the door, opened the door, and found Muriel Falconer on the Friday afternoon, and police were called.
And so did you feel like you'd made some headway in terms of, was there any DNA left at the scene? Was there a shoe print? Was there anything that made you feel closer to potentially finding this serial killer?
Yes, this was quite a unique crime scene because it was a pristine crime scene. It was a crime scene in a private home. So we had the opportunity to carry out a thorough forensic examination of the scene. Obviously, there was no fingerprints because Glover wore gloves. The whole time in all these offences, he wore gloves. But we did find a footprint in blood. They always make a mistake. At some stage, criminals make a mistake. And Glover actually walked in the victim's blood, and this became a very unique and a fabulous piece of forensic evidence.
In January 1990, so that's a few months later, a man who is now, we know, John Wayne Glover, visited a nursing home in Lane Cove, and that's when everything sort of was undone for him. What happened there that drew police attention?
Okay, now from the 23rd of November, we were prepared for another murder over the Christmas period. So we worked right through December and into January, and nothing happened. We had no other murders after Muriel Falconer. So at that point in time, we had 5 murders, and we were concentrating on a serial killer, and all the murders were connected and related. So on the 11th of January, and let me make this point, at this point in time, we had probably about 700 suspects that had been reported to the police. Either the police had discovered them themselves or had been reported. So it was quite an extensive, and we had about 80 or 90 detectives working on this murder task force. And so nothing happened over the Christmas period, and Glover had not come under notice. Up until the 11th of January, which is 8 or 9 months after the first murder, we did not know about Glover. He had not come under notice as one of the 700-odd suspects that we had. But on the 11th of January, this is where the case opened up. Glover visited a hospital at Greenwich. Now, he was a pie salesman for a very large pie company, and part of his round was to visit nursing homes and hospitals to do his pie sales round. On the 11th of January, he went into this hospital at Greenwich, and there was a lady there, an 82-year-old lady, who had a slight case of dementia and was hospitalised. And Glover went into the ward, and no one saw him, but he went into the ward, and he walked over to this lady, and he said to the lady, "Oh, you're losing your body heat." And then he pulled up her nightgown and touched her in an indecent manner. And the lady became quite perturbed. She at one stage thought it was the doctor just doing his rounds. And she became quite alarmed, and she mentioned this to the nurse. And obviously the nurse reported it to the other nurses. They became quite alarmed because no one saw who it was. And initially they probably, to some degree, doubted the story because of this lady's dementia. But however, fortunately, they believed the story. And so eventually they called the police. And the police attended, and investigated the fact that this fellow had walked in and touched this lady in an indecent manner. And eventually, from inquiries, it had turned out that they discovered that Glover, who was the pie salesman, had been the only person that had been there that morning. So the detectives decided to interview Glover. So they made inquiries and they contacted him and asked him to come in. They made an appointment and he never turned up. He never arrived to be interviewed. And so the detectives then rang his home, spoke to his wife, and she said, he's not here, he's in hospital, he's committed suicide overnight, and he's left a suicide note. Now, this was quite alarming, absolutely alarming, because all the police wanted to do was just to talk to him about, was he in the ward, did he see anything? There was nothing to suggest that Glover at that stage was the person who had touched this lady. But they just wanted to talk with Glover because he might have had some information that could have assisted. And his reaction to the police involvement was absolutely unique and unusual. So anyway, police pursued this and they went to see Glover in hospital, but he declined to be interviewed. But he allowed them to take a photograph, which they did, a Polaroid photograph of Glover. So he was uncooperative at all. He wouldn't even talk to the detectives. And so the police took that photograph back. Now, when that photograph finally reached the murder task force and we compared it with the identikit sketch drawing that had been done a month or so before, from all those inquiries we'd made about ladies being attacked in a public street all over the North Shore, the two photos, when we compared them, were nearly identical. So at that point of time, this person, Glover, the pie salesman, became a suspect under surveillance.
And he recovered and then was back out in the community and, as you say, under surveillance until March 1990, when he visited a woman named Joan Sinclair. What unfolded that day?
It was quite interesting. We'd already been working on several prime suspects other than Glover, so that when Glover came to light, it was obviously that he became quite a person of interest. So we did place him under surveillance as well. We followed him in various places. He was just conducting his pie run, doing his normal day-to-day duties, and he didn't do anything in relation to following old ladies or doing anything that would alarm us to the extent that he could be the serial killer, even though what we believe that he could have been involved in with that indecent assault. And so it was quite interesting. And we had nothing really to bring him in at that stage to interview him because we didn't at that stage want to alarm him. It was decided from a very professional point of view that we should just continue the surveillance to see what he was up to. So on the 19th of March, which was a Monday morning, Glover was travelling, doing his pie run, just travelling around in his company car, and he pulled up outside a home in the Mosman area, parked his car right out the front, got out of his car. He was dressed in a suit, tie, had a briefcase, and he went to the front door of this home. This home was occupied by Joan Sinclair, a divorcee. It was a loving welcome at the front door with a real togetherness, and so those that saw it believed that everything was okay. And so the idea was he was still on his pie run. We didn't really understand what he was doing there, but there was obviously a very welcoming receipt at the front door with this lady, and they went inside. Glover's car was parked out the front. He was in there for many hours, and police became concerned about that. So then they decided to go to the premises. They went to the front door. There was no answer. They sent police to the back door, and it looked suspicious. And then it was decided that we ought to go in and have a look. And so detectives eventually entered the premises, and as they entered the premises, they found Joan Sinclair lying in the hallway in a pool of blood. She'd actually been battered about the head, and her pantyhose had been removed and was tied around her neck. They were then wondering where Glover was. They then went into the bathroom and they found Glover in the bath, totally naked. He'd taken some tablets drunk some alcohol and was in a bathtub full of water, obviously unconscious, attempting suicide again. It turned out that this lady had a close and very personal relationship with Glover, which had been going on for several months. In other words, Joan Sinclair was his mistress, and unbeknownst to his wife and his daughters, this was carrying on. And so that meeting that morning was just a normal meeting between the two of them. We did not know anything about Joan Sinclair up until that point of time, and it turned out that Glover had decided to meet her that day. He was going to take her out for lunch, but something happened in his mind. He decided to end it all, and so he killed her and then attempted suicide.
When he was arrested and charged, what did he plead? Was there any way for him to plead insanity or suggest that he was mentally ill? Like, what did he say when he was taken to court?
At his trial, Glover pleaded not guilty to the crimes on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Now, diminished responsibility is a defence that people often raise in a criminal trial, and it simply means that they claim that there is a mental incapability. They often admit committing the crime, but they say that there was a diminished responsibility in relation to the crime because of some mental incapacity or incapable. And that is a potential defence, trying to say that their mind has been impaired or diminished, trying to get away from the hostility and the aggression and the intent to kill. However, even though he raised that, because of the circumstances of all the crimes, the Crown prosecutor maintained that Glover was well aware of his actions. When he killed, he was also planning what to do with the victim's money. And he also took time to clean his hammer. So after each of the murders, he took the hammer that he used as a weapon, took it home and washed it in acid. And so there was supreme evidence of intent with all the murders. So the defence that he raised of diminished responsibility was rejected, and he was found guilty of the murders. Now, Glover was impotent and he had no interest in sex. So the tying of the pantyhose so tightly around his victim's neck was to make sure they were dead. It had nothing to do with any type of sexual overtone or sexual motivation at all. It was just the removal of the pantyhose was simply to use it as a weapon. So it was not the work of a sexually motivated killer at all. And that was accepted by the court. He was found guilty of all the murders and several other indictable offences and sentenced to life imprisonment, never to be released.
Did they look closely at what the motivation had been in terms of that profile of his victim? I know it had been speculated that this could be someone who had a complicated relationship with their own mother, and he sort of had some hints towards his mother-in-law and some hostility there. What part do you think that played in his motivation?
I think it was everything to do with the motivation. Just a little bit of his background quickly. Originally he came from a working class family in the United Kingdom. He left school at 14 and he immigrated to Australia around about 1957. He first lived in Melbourne. In Melbourne, he was convicted of some minor larceny offences, and he was convicted of some assaulting women in Melbourne, and he was sentenced to 3 years good behaviour. His background has simply had a troubled relationship with older women in his life, especially his mother. He grew up in a home where his mother had several husbands and many boyfriends, and he loved his father. And in 1968, he moved in with his mother-in-law and his wife at Mosman. And that's where he lived with his wife and his two daughters. What happened was his mother died in 1989. And also his mother-in-law passed away. So he had this extreme hatred for his own mother. And he then developed a hatred for his mother-in-law. And the murders, the 6 murders and the 1 attempted murder, is what we call stranger killings. Glover did not know any of his victims at all. But why did he kill them? Well, the answer to that is simply that when he was killing them, he was actually killing his own mother, who was already dead. And one of the thoughts is that because his mother had died and his mother-in-law had died, he'd been robbed of the opportunity of killing them. And so he went on a killing spree, commencing in March 1989. So the motivation is from a person who absolutely hated elderly women. And so that was the motivation. Had nothing to do with him being a petty thief. It was simply revenge.
Lastly, I just wanted to ask you how that feels when you've been investigating a crime for 12 months, essentially, that has ravaged a community, that people are really, really scared for their own livelihood. What does that feel like when you find the perpetrator? Is there a sense of relief? Did you feel accomplished? What does it feel like when you see that person be sentenced and finally see justice?
I suppose there are two types of feeling for investigators. The most important, I think, is that it brings closure to all the victims. I mean, in this particular case with 6 murders and 1 attempted murder, there were many, many family members involved. These ladies were all grandmothers, and some of them were great-grandmothers. So there was massive families involved in this whole process, and extended families. And so one of the things for investigators is the feeling of the fact that there's some accomplishment in terms of the killer being found, so that families can understand what has happened and who did it. And then the other feeling is the fact of this is the end of a series of murders that totally interacted in the whole community. And there is a sense of some type of job satisfaction for the investigative team. There were detectives that worked on this case for 12 months, night and day. And there were times of utter frustration in trying to find out who is the killer, where is the killer, what is the killer doing, what can we do to catch the killer, what can we do to stop the killer. I mean, there was this intense motivation I can remember some mornings in the office where we would meet for meetings, and there was this intensity of, when are we going to get him? Let's find this killer. And so that's what drives. There is a motivation within a group of detectives that drives them to try and find the killer. And so, as I say, there's 2 types of satisfaction. One is for the family and for the victims, that it brings closure for them. But there's also a sense of job satisfaction in clearing up a serial killer. And so that does bring some type of celebration, if you can use that word, some type of celebration to the investigative group.
And some peace of mind that you won't be getting a call a week later with a similar victim, which I imagine is a relief.
Well, it was. It actually was a relief because, as I said, after 4 or 5 murders, we're all on tenterhooks waiting every moment of the day. Was there going to be a phone call? Was there going to be some type of message that, oh, we've got another one? And I remember a couple of times when we did get another one, there was an absolute solemn quietness in the group, like, oh no, it's happened again. And so we got ourselves together and continued on. So at the end of the day, when Glover was arrested and convicted and put away, there was a total relief. It was then that the task force could settle down and say, well, we know one thing, that the killer is in custody, that the killer's not going to get out, and secondly, there's not going to be another old lady murdered. And that was an absolute relief.
Mike Hagan is the former detective superintendent who led the hunt for John Wayne Glover, Sydney's infamous granny killer. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Leah Porges and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.